The Writer Stage, Unit 1, Childhood. Lesson 4, Organizing. All the world is a stage, most especially for children. Childhood is a time of performing and pretending. I remember as a child putting on plays and shows with my sisters to entertain my parents. As we got older, we became bolder, joining with neighborhood kids to put on even grander shows. What I would like for you to consider is all the time that is needed to prepare a play or a show. A play is seldom a spontaneous event. Behind the curtains backstage is where every play begins. The hours of preparing the stage, rehearsing the lines, devising special effects, sewing costumes, setting lights, and the work of the playwright composing the play. Writing an essay, preparing any written document, is like putting on a play. Indeed, the brainstorming, the organizing and drafting, and the revision of any composition, what occurs backstage, is essential to the final performance of an essay. Without that work, there would be no performance at all. At least, there would be no performance worth watching and reading. As I said in the previous lesson, the purpose of the brainstorming stage in composition is to search your memory for material. You may wonder where all your work is leading you, and whether it's really necessary. Actually, the brainstorming stage of writing is rather mysterious, and finding the connection between discovering information and organizing that information is not always easy. Does a writer gather information and then insert that information into a preconceived pattern? Many of you have been taught the pattern of the 5-paragraph essay, which used to be called the 5-paragraph theme. Students have been taught it so frequently, in fact, that they sometimes come to think in terms of 5 paragraphs. They think, do I have a thesis? Do I have 3 supporting ideas and a conclusion? If they discover 4 supporting ideas, or only 2, they panic. I've had students in my office worried because they only had 2 body paragraphs. In fact, I used to have this poster hanging on my wall. I loved it because it showed the 5-paragraph essay as a monster of sorts. That monster can be confining and limiting. On the other hand, sometimes having a pattern in mind and searching for information to satisfy that pattern can work. As I said in the last lesson, an assignment often suggests a structure of pattern or organization. Certainly, this is the case with comparison-contrast essays. Remember, for this assignment, you are to compare and/or contrast your childhood to that of today's children or to the childhood of your parents or grandparents. You should have kept this in mind during the brainstorming stage. Now, understanding the assignment, I'll turn our attention to how you might best organize your information. Since this topic clearly calls for us to compare and contrast 2 things, we will study the possibilities generally available for that purpose. Basically, there are 3. Block by block, point by point, and something called the implied pattern. First, let us examine block by block. Using the block by block organizational pattern, the writer treats each major topic as a whole, and then discusses them one at a time. For example, if I am comparing my childhood to my mom's, I would first discuss my childhood completely in Block 1. After discussing Block 1, I would compose a transition introducing Block 2. Block 2 would discuss my mom's childhood. Usually the material presented in Block 2 would be presented in a manner similar to that of Block 1. Let's take a look at a sample. My childhood versus my mom's, and hopefully I will come up with a much better title than that. After brainstorming, I realized that our 2 most interesting experiences which could be compared and contrasted were both dealing with school, writing and arithmetic. As a result, I came up with the following tentative thesis statement. For both of us, school was hard on the hands and hard on the minds. That's in Roman numeral 1 of my outline, and basically it would come at the end of my introduction, where I would have discussed schooling in general, or perhaps how schooling may have changed, and then ended with my thesis statement. I would then shift to block 1, where I would discuss my schooling completely, including my experiences with writing and my challenges with math. These might be in one paragraph or they might be in 2 separate paragraphs. I would then shift to my mom's schooling, which would be block 2. And again, I would discuss her experiences with writing and her challenges with math. The strength of the block-by-block pattern is in its simplicity. The block-by-block pattern lends itself to describing large or broad points of comparison and contrast. You examine one thing completely, then you examine the second. It also requires only one major transition, in this case from my childhood to my mom's. The drawbacks of the block-by-block pattern are that it seems to be a bit repetitive. First I discuss writing and then math. Then again I discuss writing and math. Secondly, it tends to separate the precise points of comparison and contrast. It becomes the reader's job to remember the points of comparison and contrast from block 1 while reading block 2. Fine points of comparison and contrast may be lost or obscured by being treated in different sections of the essay. The point-by-point pattern of organization is better suited to presenting fine points of comparison and contrast because it examines together corresponding points from each major subject. Points of comparison from the past and present would be presented together. So you saw that 2 major points were addressed in my other pattern, writing and math. The 2 could be reorganized and discussed in the following order. After my introduction, I would discuss writing completely, both with myself and my mom. Then I would shift to discussing math and my experiences and my mother's. Here's the same rough outline of the essay, organized in a point-by-point pattern. For both of us, school was hard on the hands and hard on the minds. And then I would shift to a section on writing, where I would discuss both my experience and my mom's. Then I would shift to challenges with math and discuss my challenges and my mother's. You can see the benefit in terms of the audience. The reader can see the comparison and contrast up close. The challenge, however, is in transitions. They are required within the paragraphs when switching from discussing my childhood to my mom's in terms of maybe writing, and then between paragraphs when I move from the writing to the challenges with math. There's a third pattern of organization called the implied pattern. This pattern requires caution. If you're writing for an audience very knowledgeable about one of the subjects, an implied comparison and contrast pattern can be created by clearly describing the subject about which the audience is not knowledgeable. So let's say a grandfather is writing to kids today. He assumes kids already know a great deal about their own experience, so he may choose to focus his essay on his own experience. An implied pattern of comparison and contrast looks like this. First, there would be an introduction, and it would end with his thesis statement. Then Grandpa would talk about his schooling and provide several details. Secondly, he would discuss his outdoor play and again provide several details. It's within these details that he would include lots of references to today, thereby comparing and contrasting. The danger in the implied pattern is that it assumes much about the readers. It assumes the readers understand the implied subject in a particular way. If the readers do not understand the implied comparison contrast, then the essay becomes unclear and ineffective. Generally, it's best to describe subjects being compared and contrasted in a block-by-block or point-by-point pattern, and personally, I prefer point-by-point. The patterns I've described are not intended to be used like fill-in-the-blank forms, though. So how do you use these patterns? Here are a few tips to keep in mind. First, any pattern can work. Just be aware of their limitations. Block by block can be confusing because points of comparison or contrast may be far apart in the essay. The point-by-point pattern requires special attention to creating smooth transitions between each group of items. And implied comparisons and contrasts make greater demands on the audience by expecting readers to have certain kinds of knowledge. The second tip is that when organizing, you should be leaving the most important information for last. You might recall that I discussed writing first in my sample outline and then math. I left math for last because it was a cause of great consternation for me. It also brought my mom some emotional challenges as well. For that reason, no matter what pattern I choose, I will discuss math last to emphasize its importance in our emotional development and to emphasize our similar experiences. The invention stage and the drafting stage are parts of the writing process that cannot be avoided. Students often feel like there should be an easier way. It can seem a waste of time to generate more information than is actually used, or to write drafts that get rejected or that require major revisions. Sometimes writing can be easy, but more often than not, it requires much effort. The next lesson is Lesson 6. Please note the change. I've changed the process from the textbook's original format, and I will discuss Lesson 6 before Lesson 5, which is the peer edit lesson. In Lesson 6, we'll talk about style. In fact, each unit has a lesson on various stylistic elements. I have you work on the lesson at the same time that I have you draft your essay, because I want you to try to utilize those elements of style in your essay. For that reason, the final lesson numerically in every unit comes before the peer edit lesson. So, next up, Lesson 6.